In September of 2022, in Caracas, Ibrahim Raisi and Nicolas Maduro sat down at a table and signed a 20-year strategic cooperation agreement between Iran and Venezuela. 20 years. Most Western outlets that covered it at all treated it as a photo opportunity between two isolated governments looking for friends. A few paragraphs, maybe a wire story, and then everyone moved on. I want to argue that was a catastrophic misread, because 3 years later, when you actually look at what got built in the shadow of that signature, you're not looking at a symbolic friendship. You're looking at the construction of a second front on the other side of the planet from Tehran inside America's own hemisphere. And almost nobody in the mainstream conversation is treating it as what it actually is. Here's what everyone assumes when they think about Iran's strategy. Pressure Israel through Lebanon, pressure the Gulf through Hormuz, build nuclear leverage, wait out the sanctions. Iran playing defense in its own neighborhood. I want to argue the opposite. While the entire world was watching the Middle East, Iran was quietly opening a completely different theater 3,000 miles from any battlefield anyone was paying attention to. 1. Iran helped stand up a drone production facility on Venezuelan soil. 2. A sanctioned Iranian airline has been running a regular air bridge between Tehran and Caracas for years, moving people and cargo that nobody outside a few analysts ever tracks. 3. A financial and logistics network tied to Hezbollah has operated in South America for 3 decades, and it just got a new government sponsor with an entire national territory to work inside of. Individually, these look like 3 unrelated stories about a poor sanctioned country doing business with another poor sanctioned country. Together they are one strategy, and I think it has a name. Over the next 15 minutes, I want to walk you through what I'm calling the mirror doctrine, because that's exactly what this is. In 1823, the United States declared the Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere was America's sphere and outside powers had no business establishing themselves inside it. That doctrine has quietly shaped 200 years of American foreign policy, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Cold War interventions across Central America. It is the single oldest, most consistently enforced assumption in the entire American strategic playbook. For decades, meanwhile, the United States has treated the Middle East as its own forward theater, projecting military and political power into a region on the other side of the world because it decided that region mattered to American interests. Iran just did the same thing back, in the one place the Monroe Doctrine was supposed to make untouchable, not with an army, with infrastructure. The question the mainstream coverage keeps asking is whether Venezuela and Iran are just two broke, sanctioned regimes helping each other survive. That's the wrong question. The right question is, what does it mean, strategically, that Iran now has an operational foothold inside the exact hemisphere the United States has spent 2 centuries treating as sacred ground? Let's start with the drones, because I think this is the piece that should have gotten the most attention and got almost none. Satellite imagery and reporting from analysts tracking Iranian drone proliferation identified a facility inside Venezuela in the state of Aragua built with Iranian design assistance, producing unmanned aircraft modeled on the same Mohajer line architecture Iran has exported to proxies across the Middle East. Think about what that actually means for a second. This isn't Iran selling Venezuela a batch of finished drones. That would just be an arms deal, the kind of thing that happens between sanctioned states all the time. This is Iran exporting the manufacturing capability itself, the blueprints, the technicians, the production line. Once you export the factory instead of the product, you've done something categorically different. You've planted a node that can produce hardware indefinitely without another shipment ever having to cross an ocean, without another sanctions violation ever showing up on a bill of lading. I call this the export the factory, not the weapon problem. And it is the exact same model Iran has used to build durable proxy capability everywhere else it operates. The difference this time is the address. It isn't Beirut, it isn't Sana'a, it's inside the Western Hemisphere. Now let's talk about the air bridge, because this is the part that's been sitting in plain sight the entire time. Mahan Air, Iran's flag airline, has been under direct United States Treasury sanctions since 2011 for providing logistical support to Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Despite that, Mahan Air has continued operating flights connecting Tehran to Caracas, frequently coordinating with Conviasa, Venezuela's own state airline, which is separately sanctioned. Analysts and journalists who have tracked these routes describe cargo manifests that are vague at best, and passenger lists that intelligence services on both continents have flagged as carrying more than tourists and businessmen. Here's the frame I want you to hold onto. A functioning, repeated, scheduled air corridor between a sanctioned state actor and its new hemispheric partner is not a supply chain hiccup. It is infrastructure. Sanctions are designed to choke off exactly this kind of sustained, reliable movement of people and material. When the corridor keeps running for years despite the sanctions regime that tells you the sanctions aren't failing by accident, they're being routed around on a schedule in plain sight. And then there's the piece with the longest history, the piece most Americans have never heard of at all. The tri-border area, where Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay meet, has been documented for 3 decades as a hub for Hezbollah fundraising, smuggling, and logistics. This isn't speculation. It's the conclusion of Argentine federal prosecutors investigating the 1994 bombing of the Amir Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires, an attack that killed 85 people and that Argentine courts have formally attributed to Hezbollah operating with Iranian state direction. Argentina designated Hezbollah a terrorist organization in 2019. The network survived that designation. It survived the death of the prosecutor who built the case against it. What's different now is context. For 30 years, that network existed in the shadows, tolerated or ignored by governments that didn't want the diplomatic headache of confronting it directly. Now Iran has an actual head of state in the region, publicly aligned 20 years into a cooperation agreement, with every incentive to look the other way while that older financial network deepens its roots. You take a decades-old dormant asset and you give it a friendly government next door. That's not a coincidence of geography, that's a force multiplier. There's a fourth piece, and I think it's the one that actually explains why the other 3 exist at all. Money. Both Iran and Venezuela have been locked out of the dollar-based banking system for years, and both sit on enormous energy reserves they can't fully monetize through normal channels. Reporting going back to 2020 documented Iranian tankers delivering gasoline and refinery parts to Venezuela at a moment when Venezuela's own refining capacity had collapsed, in exchange for gold reserves pulled directly out of Venezuela's central bank vaults. Fuel for gold, state to state, completely outside SWIFT, completely outside any banking system either country could actually still access. That single trade relationship is the financial circulatory system underneath everything else. The drone facility needs Iranian technicians paid somehow. The Mahan air corridor needs fuel and maintenance paid somehow. None of that runs on goodwill. It runs on a working alternative payment system that 2 sanctioned governments built together. Gold moving one direction, refined fuel moving the other, with no dollar and no compliance department anywhere in between. Now, I want to steelman the other side of this, because I think the strongest counter-argument deserves a real hearing, not a straw man. The case against everything I just said goes like this. Iran and Venezuela are both catastrophically sanctioned, both cut off from global banking, both desperate for any partner willing to trade with them. Of course they signed a cooperation agreement. Of course a broke petrostate buys cheap drone technology instead of expensive finished weapons. This isn't grand strategy. It's 2 isolated governments doing the only kind of business anyone will still do with them. And there's real weight to that argument. Sanctioned states gravitate toward each other because they have no other options, not because they're executing a master plan. I don't think that argument is stupid. But here's what it can't explain. Desperate transactional trade doesn't usually come with a manufacturing facility. It doesn't usually come with a sustained multi-year air corridor that both governments keep running despite the diplomatic cost. Poor countries buy things. They don't typically build durable production infrastructure inside a partner's sovereign territory unless both sides expect the relationship to outlast the current emergency. The infrastructure is the tell. You build a factory when you're planning to still need it in 10 years. So let's pull this together. Iran didn't send Venezuela a shipment of drones. It exported the ability to make them indefinitely. Iran didn't run a one-time cargo flight. It built a repeating corridor that has survived sanctions for years. And Iran didn't invent a network in the tri-border area. It inherited one that already had 30 years of infrastructure and gave it, for the first time, a friendly head of state next door willing to provide cover. 3 separate stories, 1 mirror doctrine. Iran projecting into America's hemisphere exactly the way America has spent decades projecting into Iran's. I want to be honest with you. I could be wrong about how far this goes. Read the primary sources yourself and draw your own conclusions. So here's what I watch over the next few months. First, watch whether the United States Treasury issues any new sanctions designations naming specific entities or individuals inside Venezuela tied to Iranian drone production. A new designation is confirmation that intelligence agencies are tracking expansion, not just a facility we already know about. Second, watch Mahan Air's flight frequency to Caracas. If that corridor is scaling up rather than holding steady, that tells you cargo volume is increasing, not just continuing. Third, watch for reporting on whether this cooperation model gets exported again to Nicaragua or Bolivia, both of which have separately signed their own agreements with Tehran. If the drone facility model shows up in a second country, this stops being a Venezuela story and becomes a hemisphere story. For homework, I want you to go read the United States Treasury's own designation documents on Mahan Air, which lay out in detail exactly what the sanctions were designed to stop. Read the Argentine federal prosecutor's findings on the Emir bombing and Hezbollah's presence in the tri-border area. And look at the actual text of the 2022 Iran-Venezuela Cooperation Agreement, not the summary, the text, and ask yourself how a 20-year horizon squares with the idea that this is just two desperate governments doing short-term survival trade. Because here's the question I want to leave you with. For 80 years, the entire architecture of American foreign policy has rested on one assumption, that the Western Hemisphere is settled ground, and the real chessboard is somewhere else. The Middle East, the Pacific, Europe. What happens to that assumption the moment the chessboard shows up in your own backyard and you're the last one to notice it's already there? Think about that. I'll see you in the next video.